Research Seminar today. Today, very happy to welcome our friends from ADB, economists from ADB. Quickly, I will introduce the presenters today, and I'll present the topics which they will be presenting. The format of the event is that each of the presenters will present the papers for an hour, including questions and answer session. The first presenter today is Dr.Arief Ramayandi. He is currently an economist at the Economics and Research Department at the Asian Development Bank, which is headquartered in the Philippines. Dr. Arief received his master and PhD in economics from the Australian National University in Australia and has a research interest in open macroeconomic policies and economic modeling. Our second presenter today is Dr. Donghyun Park. He's also an economist, a principal economist at the ADB in the Philippines. Dr. Park received his PhD in economics from UCLA and has his main research fields in international finance and trade, including policy-oriented topics such as the long-term development issues in Asia. And he's also played the leading role in this booklet that I think Dr. Park gave away, the Asian Development Outlook publication. Today, the presenters will present their two forthcoming books. The first one is about the global financial crisis and why did Asian countries fare so well, fare much better during the global financial crisis than the Asian financial crisis. And I believe Dr. Arief will be the first presenter, and then Dr. Park will present the second presentation, which is developing the service sector as an engine of growth for Asia. Also, the book is been given to you, I believe. Please join me in welcome Dr. Arief in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As has been mentioned, I'm going to talk about this topic today. Why did Asian countries fare better during the global financial crisis than how they fared during the Asian financial crisis? This is a chapter inside a book written by myself, my colleague Donghyun Park, and also our good friend Shin from Korea University. That particular chapter appears in this volume called Responding to Financial Crisis, Lessons from Asia Then, the United States and Europe Now, edited by Jung and Adam Olsen, which was a joint effort from the ADB as well and Peterson Institute for International Economics to try to provide some better understanding about what's going on between the two crises that we have seen in the last decade or so. This particular volume has just been published last month, and I have to excuse myself that I didn't bring a hard copy with me on this trip. So if necessary, I will be sending TDRI a copy later on after I come back to Manila. In this presentation, I will touch upon three things. The first one is I'm going to tell you guys about what motivates the book, and then I'm going to touch about the structure of the book to give you some flavor of what was being discussed within that particular volume. And then in the last part of the presentation, I will be focusing on Asia's performance during both Asia financial crisis as well as during the global financial crisis, which is just a chapter within the whole volume. Why the book? We see that Asia was devastated during the Asian financial crisis, and then when we finally slowly coming out from the crisis, policymakers both around the region as well as internationally thinks at least that they have gained knowledge about how to prevent, mitigate, as well as resolve crisis in the future. Yet recently, we see another crisis, bigger crisis coming up, originated from the US. However, Asian countries, at this time at the very least, faring better and seems to be not being affected so much by the worst of the global financial crisis. The book itself tried to illuminate the contrast between Asia performance during the more recent crisis with its performance during its own crisis in 97-98. And it also highlights the gap between what the US and EU leaders recommended to our region before and what they have been practicing since then. Main lessons coming out from the volume is that the crisis should be treated as something that is likely, or it's likely to happen, and hence authorities throughout the region has to be always prepared about facing one in some times. Now, the structure of the book itself, it is started with an introduction written by the editors that give you a whole flavor of the book. In chapter 2 of the book, there is lessons coming from the 2 lost decades in Japan, written by Hawaii and Morgan. The main message that they came up with is that accommodative monetary policy combined with steps to encourage banks to clean up their balance sheet are necessary once an asset bubbles collapses. That particular chapter is being followed by a chapter written by Gavin and Hintzweiger that focuses on how central banks in advanced economies responded to the global financial crisis. In this chapter, they particularly stresses that an adequate amount of stimulus policy packages are needed to be launched at the right time in order to deal with a large negative shocks that causes crisis. Chapter 4 is what we are going to discuss today, which basically focuses on how Asia is behaving within the 2 crises. It is followed with another chapter that basically looks at the policy advice and the actions given during the event of Asian financial crisis, as well as the more recent event of global financial crisis. In this chapter, Johnson and Wack basically suggest that Western countries, although they have drew some lessons from Asian crisis in 1990s, they still failed to apply the lessons to themselves. So hence they didn't manage to avoid this classic emerging type of crisis from happening in their own economies. Policy prescriptions for Asia after the crisis were not applied in the United States, and in particular in terms of highlighting the role of, or the concept of too big to fail financial institution. The US authorities applied various forms of implicit and government financial support to help this large institution from collapsing, which is basically in opposition to what they did or what they suggested to Asia back then in 97-98. And this increased moral hazards to the financial system, global financial system in the future, and possibly have negative consequences for the global financial stability. In chapter 6, Truman was highlighting the role of International Monetary Fund in dealing with crisis. He reveals in that particular chapter that Asian crisis and the ongoing European crisis are more similar than different, despite the former is a lot less severe than the later. Main lessons that he drew out of this chapter is that despite promises to the contrary, history tends to repeat itself, and non-crisis countries should realize that they have a stake in preventing and managing crisis in other countries. So the interconnectedness of economies throughout the globe means that a crisis occurring in one country is not solely a problem or a responsibility of that particular countries, but also going to affect some other countries that are at least connected to the economy. He also stresses that the IMF and its surveillance mechanism should focus more than just more than just on to an individual countries that might be affected by crisis, but also on larger monetary unions type of entities like what we have in Europe. On that front, Chapter 7 followed up by suggesting that regional financial safety nets might be a way to go to lessen the crisis. This chapter is written by Dong-Hyun, Samulong, and Veli. Basically argues that both AEFC, the Asian financial crisis, and the European crisis has contributed to the development and deepening of regional safety nets arrangements. They argue that regional arrangements could be an important feature in preventing crisis, but in order to apply that kind of arrangements, a region must coordinate with the IMF in order to ensure that the regionalism itself does not contradict the globalization progress of the progress of the global economy in more general. In Chapter 8, Haggard put a cautions on the suggestion that must be put forward about regionalism by pointing out that regional arrangements must grapple with the difficult to manage trade-offs between timely provision of liquidity and risk opportunism and moral hazards. While coordination between regional arrangements and the IMF would seem ideal, implementing such arrangements would be a challenge due to different vested interests in the global players. Division of labor between regional and international players might be a more realistic way to go rather than trying to push a coordination between regional type of crisis prevention arrangements and the more global kind of setup. Last but not least, Chapter 9 looks at sovereign debt in Asia. This chapter is written by Bill Klein, who basically highlights that the success of Asia, learning from the lessons that of the recent sovereign debt crisis, to avoid high ratios of external debts. They also highlights that Asia has been pursuing relatively sound management of fiscal deficit and debts, and have managed to rely more on domestic currency denominated debt after the Asian financial crisis. That's basically the 8 chapters that is included in the book. I wouldn't go for more detail on 8 chapters, and I would welcome you to look at the volume if you're interested. But to reiterate the overall lessons of the volume, basically we found that countries need to prepare for a crisis as if that the crisis itself cannot be prevented. Countries also need to make room for stabilization policies during good times so that they can be ready in rapidly deploy those policies, those stabilization policies once a crisis hits. And in addition, countries also need to address the self-insurance globally if they can, or regionally if they must. The last thing here in particular is not so much analyzed in the book. It came out as an idea rather than a formal assessment of what has been going on so far. But this is certainly one of the future research agenda that was to be pursued in the next end of book. Now I'd like to switch into the Asian story of the 2 crises. The background of this particular chapter is the fact that Asia has suffered a devastating crisis in 97-98, but yet it came out rather remarkably well during the more recent crisis, 2008, 2009, or 2010. It is natural then for one to ask, why is it the case? Because basically, those two crises has been characterized with a same large outflow of capital from the region. Now, Asia is particularly not immune to the crisis, and we shouldn't be overconfident by thinking that Asia will not be affected at all by such kind of event, such kind of global event. In this sense, then we are going to compare and contrast the symptoms prior to each crisis by focusing on 5 East Asian economies that hit hardest by the Asian financial crisis, namely 4 ASEAN economies: Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and South Korea in the East Asia. We then do a qualitative analysis on the macro state of these economies leading to the crisis to understand better what are the similarities and differences that leads these economies to have different kind of responses to both crises. And then we also add a more formal empirical analysis about the determinants of financial crisis using a global data and draw implication to the 5 East Asian economy. The chapter will also look at the determinants of a depth of a crisis and the determinants of the strength of crisis recovery. Now, the stylized facts coming out from the crisis is looked at through real GDP development, real exchange rate movements, exports, investment, and also macro policies. Now, in terms of real GDP, figure 1 here compares the economic growth, real economic growth in the average real economic growth in EA5 countries during the Asian financial crisis and during the global financial crisis. Now, if we look at the charts here, during the Asian financial crisis, those 5 economies were being hit very hard and much harder than what they were exposed to during the global financial crisis. Right? In terms of exchange rate, the 5 economies are experiencing large depreciation of currencies, while in the later crisis, global financial crisis, 2008 to 10, there was not much depreciation taking place, and then recovery also leads the exchange rate to a new equilibrium, to back to the old equilibrium level before the crisis took place. Real export growth rates also show some differences here. During the Asian financial crisis, real export grew positively before plunges in the first years of recovery period, while in the global financial crisis, exports went down immediately. Now, these tendencies shows the difference of environment that each of these 5 economies are dealing with. During the Asian financial crisis, the global economy was performing well, and hence demand for export products is not being affected. At least it's not being negatively affected initially because of 2 things: the demand is still there, and the price is cheaper due to a sharp depreciation of currencies. However, in the first years of the recovery process, the production capacity of these 5 economies is being negatively affected by the crisis, and hence export went down, not because the demand from the global economy is weakening, but mostly because of the capacity to supply those exports is not as much as what it was before the crisis took place. In the global financial crisis event, the trend is completely different. What happened here is that the global demand is weakening immediately after the crisis, and hence Asian countries lost their markets. This is what we observed during the global financial crisis. Investment also behaves differently during the two crises. In the Asian financial crisis, investment fell down and never recovered to the previous level, while in the global financial crisis, there was nothing significant happening to the investment on the region. Now, the other striking difference between the two crisis events, also observed in the macro policy responses that the authorities in these 5 Asian economies during the Asian financial crisis, growth rate of government expenditures becomes negative, so there is a contractionary fiscal policies took place during that crisis, while in the global financial crisis, the fiscal policy is actually expansionary. Right? On the monetary policy front, interest rate also contract. Interest rate jumps up significantly during the Asian financial crisis, marking a contraction in monetary policy, while the same thing does not occur in the global financial crisis. Monetary policy is actually being eased up during the global financial crisis. So these are the stylized facts that highlighted that overall internal structural problems contributed considerably to the outbreak of the Asian financial crisis, and robust external demand have helped the 5 countries to export their way out of the crisis. In contrast, during the global financial crisis, the 5 Asian economies cannot export their way out of the crisis, but they are living in a relatively strong internal fundamental, and hence not being affected as much as what they experienced back in 97-98. Another important difference between two crises is the fact that the stance of monetary and fiscal policy are completely different. To have a better understanding about what's going on, we look at each of the individual country data more carefully in this part of the analysis. Particularly, we look at what happened in the period leading up to the two crises. Now, if you look at the output deviation from trend, output gap has grown tremendously before the Asian financial crisis. Although the same trend is observed before the global financial crisis, the magnitude is nowhere near what we observed here in before 97-98. Inflation average in the period leading up to Asian financial crisis is a lot higher than the average inflation in the non-crisis period. While in the period leading up to global financial crisis, inflation are generally lower than or near the average of non-crisis levels. This basically shows that an internal problem is taking place here. Well, in this case here, global financial crisis, that internal problem, even though they might be there, the magnitude is nowhere near what was happening in period leading up to Asian financial crisis. Share of investment and current account to GDP also gives some nice explanation about what's going on in those 5 economies. Now, massive surge in investment prior to Asian financial crisis was accompanied by high rates of imports, leading to a large current account deficit in East Asia, despite the fact that these countries are pursuing an export-led growth strategy. Right? So, investment share dropped sharply after the crisis in 97-98 and never recovered since then. This tendency has reversed the condition in current account balance for that region, reversing the saving investment gap into positive territory, and hence make room to lower interest rates that partly explains why we have lower interest rates during the global financial crisis. Right? Nominal exchange rate is playing significant role in explaining the different behavior of investment and the current account during the two crises. Overvalued currencies prior to the Asian financial crisis has led to cheaper import prices, and hence also lower. That overvalued currencies also lowered the cost of borrowing overseas at the same time. These two things in combination has fueled a boom of investment to the region that is relied pretty much on external debt as well as imported capital goods. Once the crisis hits, the massive correction to misaligned exchange rates took place and reversed the above trend. Now, if you look at the chart on the left, basically, it shows you how much depreciation took place in the Asian financial crisis relative to the amount of depreciation took place in the global financial crisis. As you see in the chart, the magnitude of depreciation following global financial crisis is nowhere near the magnitude observed following the Asian financial crisis. This particular behavior of exchange rate has then haunted the authorities throughout the region and motivates them to build up reserves despite adopting a more flexible exchange rate regime. This thing is somewhat helped by the positive current account balance position, and during the global financial crisis has also helped in defending the Asian currencies from dipping down too far. Now, a more flexible exchange rate regime adopted after the Asian financial crisis is giving a positive implication to the 5 East Asian economies. Now, this table here gives you the residual from interest parity conditions prior to Asian financial crisis and prior to global financial crisis. In the period prior to Asian financial crisis, we observed negative values throughout except for the Philippines. That negative value basically suggests that domestic interest rate at that particular period is lower than what is needed to match the changes in the exchange rate. In other words, what's going on if we have a negative value here is that interest rate has been very low at that particular point of time, and hence authority does not have a capacity to lower interest rate further and stimulate the economy if needed to. Right? A different thing is observed during the global financial crisis when we have positive values for these residuals. This basically says that interest rates at that time is high enough or is in a comfortable enough position to be moved down further if needed to. Or in other words, what this suggests that during this period, except for the South Korea, these countries has a capacity to stimulate economies through a more expansionary monetary policies. And that explains basically why interest rate has to jump so much after the Asian financial crisis relative to what we observed in the period of global financial crisis. In summary, the different fundamentals prior to AFC and GFC had major implication for monetary and fiscal policy. Prior to AFC, there was no scope for easing monetary policy further, while in contrast, prior to GFC, there was plenty of scope to do monetary policy expansion. On fiscal policy front, consolidation has become inevitable after Asian financial crisis, making them unable to release expansionary fiscal policy. Well, this thing is not observed in the period after global financial crisis. And hence, stronger fundamentals prior to global financial crisis has enabled the EA5 countries to implement appropriate macroeconomic policy. This is one lesson that we learned from what we just discussed previously. To strengthen the arguments here, now we are looking at the empirical framework that basically tries to explain the determinants of a likelihood of a crisis, the determinants of a depth of a crisis when it took place, and determinants of the strength of recovery after a crisis happens. Right? So basically, in a graphical representation, what we are looking at is what determines a crisis here. What affects the possibility of a country running into crisis? What affects the magnitude of the depth of a crisis that a country is undergoing? And what could help in determining the strength of recovery after a country went through a crisis? Right? In this empirical framework, we are considering a number of economic variables that is considered as early warning indicators in the literature. Early warning indicators that signal crisis in the literature. For this purpose, we look at most recent and significant studies conducted by Kronchas and Osfeld in 2012, as well as Frankel and Saravelis in 2010. We end up looking at 7 indicators that are pretty much consistent with the macro indicators that we have discussed earlier in the qualitative part of the analysis. That is foreign reserves to GDP, relative to GDP, average 5 years average of real exchange rate appreciation, credit growth to credit to GDP, average growth rate to GDP, current account balance to GDP, average of inflation rate, and export share to GDP. To assess whether or not those determinants or those indicators is informative of a crisis, then we conduct a bivariate regressions for each individual determinants chosen, and we also do a multivariate panel regressions to see how the likelihood of a crisis, the depth of a crisis, or the strength of recovery from crisis is being affected by each of the indicators. Now, for a likelihood of a crisis, we use a panel probability estimation with random effects, and for the depth of a crisis as well as recovery from crisis, we use a pooled ordinary least square regressions. All explanatory variables here are being lagged by 1 period because we want to capture the state of the state of the economy before the crisis took place, or before the recovery started. Right? For the depth of the crisis and for the recovery of the crisis regressions, we also include measures of fiscal and monetary policy to see how these macro policies might affect the depth of a crisis as well as the speed of recovery from a crisis that a country might have. For the determinant of a crisis, all the chosen variables is found to be informative about crisis, hence they really have values to be looked at as a signal of possible crisis. And however, for a global financial crisis, only 4 came up significant: real exchange rate appreciation, domestic credit expansion, real GDP growth rates, and the export share to GDP. This differences highlights the fact that global financial crisis was solely originated from external situation to the Asian economies under consideration, and hence they are the ones that are significantly affecting the crisis at those times. For the depth of the crisis, in general, a crisis is deeper if the pre-crisis inflation rate is higher, if pre-crisis domestic credit expansion is larger, if the pre-crisis real GDP growth rate is higher, and if the interest rate increases during the crisis, and or growth rate of real government expenditure decreases during the crisis. So basically, what we found here is that a crisis is going to be deeper if a country is undergoing internal imbalances, more severe internal imbalances, and if the country is not doing appropriate accommodative macro policy to deal with the crisis. In the global crisis, besides the policy variable, higher credit expansion and higher exchange rate appreciation before a crisis does make recession deeper. So this basically highlights the difference between the origin of a crisis. When a crisis is homegrown, basically fundamentals are going to be more significant in affecting the depth of a problem that a country is facing. While if the crisis is grown externally, not domestically originated, usually it will come through a channel of financial flows like capital inflows and outflows. Now, in terms of recovery of a crisis, we found that policy variables such as monetary policy and fiscal policy expansion are significant in explaining quick recovery from a crisis, and therefore, and there is some evidence that the recovery is faster when the export share is higher. For a global crisis, policy variables continue to be significant in explaining fast recovery, and we also found that evidence that higher foreign reserves and real GDP growth rates, as well as current account surplus, expedite the recovery process. Right? Now, on this front, the point to be taken is that the fact that no matter the crisis coming from internal problem or from external problem, accommodative macro policy would actually be a positive thing to have if we want to expedite the process, the recovery process. The key empirical results for the Asian economies that we are considering in the paper basically suggest that fundamentals were much more stronger in Asia 5, in East Asia 5, during the global crisis. Those are the variables that are stronger fundamentally, and policy was more appropriate for reviving demand in global crisis. Here basically answers the question we have about why the performance of these 5 East Asian economies differ during the AFC and the GFC. Concluding observation, the overall empirical analysis yields a number of important and interesting findings. First of all, economic fundamentals exert significant influence in the likelihood of a crisis. The fundamentals will also significantly affect the depth of a crisis experienced by countries, and a policy stance during the crisis matters in expediting the speed of recovery from a crisis. To sum up, the evidence strongly suggests that economic fundamentals and macroeconomic policy matter a lot in staving off crisis, cushioning its blow, and laying down a foundation for a crisis recovery. I think I will stop there. Thanks very much.